Hi, my name is Logan Torf, and I love movies. They're a big passion of mine and have had a huge impact on me. They've shown me creative worlds and the characters that inhabit them. They've shown me imaginative stories that keep me engaged and have sparked my own imagination. Films have become so inspirational to me that I've made my own. On this channel, I want to go in depth on these movies that sparked my interest in film, covering several different genres, including horror, science fiction, action, adventure, drama, comedy, fantasy, and more. Starting this series of reviews is the 1980 horror film Friday the 13th. When talking about Friday the 13th as a whole, it's hard not to see the impact that it has made, becoming one of the most iconic horror movie franchises of all time, as well as creating one of the most iconic villains in horror movie history, Jason Voorhees. It's also not hard to look at all of the flaws in this franchise. One-dimensional characters, bland plot, and cheesy moments are what people think about when the franchise is brought up, which isn't a stretch to say. The Friday the 13th series doesn't exactly have the best track record, given the fact that they came out so sporadically, especially in the 80s, and with there having so far been 12 movies in this franchise, it's not hard to see why the series eventually declined in quality, with the movies not getting much love from critics when they first came out. Unfortunately, due to copyright issues, we haven't gotten a Friday the 13th movie since 2009. But with news of a prequel series coming out in 2025, it shows that there is still life in this franchise. Despite the movies not being well received with critics, fans love these movies to death, showing their love and admiration for the franchise with tributes, cosplays, and several fan films being made. Fans love these movies and I love them too, so I'm gonna show my love for these movies as well as going in depth on these movies, explaining the good, the bad, and the significance they had on the horror genre and on pop culture as a whole. I will also go in depth on other films eventually of different genres. And since Friday the 13th and A Nightmare on Elm Street are both part of the same universe, I will be reviewing those movies as well between the Friday the 13th reviews. I will also be reviewing the Never Hike Alone films and Dylan's New Nightmare because despite being fan films and not being considered part of the same continuity of the original films, they have some returning actors as their respective characters from the original films, so to me, they're canon. You can agree to disagree, it's only my personal opinion. You're free to agree or disagree with what. With that out of the way, how these reviews are going to work is that I'm going to provide a plot synopsis for the movie, and then I'm going to be breaking down and focusing on 4 aspects: story, characters, and since this is a horror movie, I'll be looking at the horror aspects, and then I'll describe the impact the movie has made, and then I'll conclude the review with my final thoughts on the film as a whole, and I will rank it on a scale of 1 to 10. Without further ado, here's my review of Friday the 13th. The film starts off in Camp Crystal Lake, 1958. We see a POV of a mystery person walking through the cabins. We see the camp counselors singing campfire songs together when 2 of them, Barry and Claudette, sneak off together to fool around. We see the POV of the mystery person walking to where they are. When the camp counselors realize they're being watched, they get attacked by the mystery person, with Barry getting stabbed in the stomach and Claudette getting killed off screen in a freeze frame. We cut to Friday, June 13th, present day, as we see a girl named Annie walking in a small town heading to Camp Crystal Lake. She walks inside one of the buildings and asks the townspeople where Camp Crystal Lake is, getting a lot of stares because of it. She is offered a ride by a truck driver, and a guy named Crazy Ralph tells Annie not to go to Camp Blood, as he calls it, saying that she will die there as the camp has a death curse. In the truck driver tells Annie about Camp Crystal Lake, telling her about the 2 counselors that were murdered at the beginning of the film in 1958, about a boy drowning in 1957, several mysterious fires being caused, and the water being poisoned in 1962. He says that nobody knows who caused it and tells Annie to quit. Annie just brushes it off, thinking it was just some stupid ghost stories. She gets dropped off by the truck driver, and we cut to more of our characters, Ned, Jack, and Marcy, who are also on their way to Camp Crystal Lake. When they arrive, they are greeted by the owner, Steve Christie, and our final girl, Alice. We see Alice considering leaving to sort some things out, but Steve convinces her to stay. We see her later, where we meet a new character, Bill, who's also working at the camp, where we see our mysterious person watching from afar. We cut to all of the campers meeting together with Steve Christie, telling them to continue working on the camp. We continue seeing them work on the camp, where we meet our final camper, Brenda, working on the archery range, where Ned starts messing with her. We later see Annie again, as she gets picked up by an unseen driver as they drive past Camp Crystal Lake. When Annie realizes this, she starts begging the driver to stop the car. When they don't do that, Annie jumps off the car. The driver gets out of the car and starts chasing Annie. When Annie thinks she's safe, she runs into the killer and gets her throat slit. We cut back to the other counselors in Camp Crystal Lake, who have no idea that they are being watched by the unseen killer. Ned pulls another prank when he fakes drowning to get a kiss from Brenda, all while the killer is still watching them. After the counselors get out of the lake, they realize there's a snake inside one of the cabins, and they chase it around, with Bill finally catching it and chopping it up with a machete. After that, the counselors get approached by a police officer, with the counselors telling him that they're rebuilding. The police officer tells them that Crazy Ralph is heading towards the camp and tells them to be careful. When the police officer leaves, we see Alice in the kitchen as she finds Crazy Ralph hiding in the pantry, saying that they're all doomed if they stay and that the camp has a death curse. Later, we see Jack and Marcy dancing by the shore, and Ned is by himself when he finds a mysterious person in one of the cabins and follows them inside. We cut back to Jack and Marcy together when a storm comes by and forces them and the rest of the counselors into separate cabins. Jack and Marcy proceed to do it, and Alice, Bill, and Brenda decide to play a game of Monopoly. We cut back to Jack and Marcy, who have no idea that the body of Ned is in the bed above them, having his throat slit off screen. When Jack and Marcy are done doing it, Marcy leaves to go to the bathroom, leaving Jack alone. He then notices blood dripping from Ned's body in the bed above him. Before Jack can realize what's happening, he's grabbed from underneath the bed and is stabbed in the neck by an arrow. We find Marcy in the bathroom after, where she hears some noises behind one of the shower curtains. When she pulls back the curtain and sees no one, she turns around and gets killed by an axe to the face. Back to Alice, Bill, and Brenda as they finish up their game of Monopoly. Brenda leaves for her cabin, and we catch up with Steve Christie, who has been at a diner due to the storm. He eventually leaves the diner, and we find Brenda in the same bathroom Marcy was in earlier, getting ready for bed. We cut back to Steve Christie, whose car seems to be stuck and is picked up by a police officer driving by. We cut back to Brenda again, getting ready for bed, when all of a sudden she hears a child outside crying for help. Brenda goes outside to find the child, but ends up being blinded by the mystery person turning on the lights in the archery range. Cutting back to Alice and Bill in the cabin as Brenda's scream is heard. Alice and Bill decide to check on Brenda, but when they arrive at her cabin, they find a bloody axe in her bed, realizing that something strange is going on. They continue going through the different cabins of the camp in search for the rest of the counselors, but with no luck. They decide to call someone, but they can't, as the mystery killer has cut the phone line. They try to leave in their car, but the car doesn't start. We see Steve Christie with the police officer as they talk about Friday the 13th, when Steve Christie gets dropped off by the officer. When he arrives at the camp, he's blinded by a flashlight. He recognizes the person, but ends up getting stabbed in the stomach. Alice and Bill start lighting some lanterns due to the generators not working. Alice falls asleep in the cabin while Bill goes to fix the generators. When Alice wakes up, she starts making coffee for herself. After a while, Alice goes looking for Bill once she realizes he's been gone for a long time. She finds Bill's poncho near the generator, and when she turns around, she finds Bill's body pinned up against the door of the generator room by arrows and with his throat slit. Alice freaks out and runs back to the cabin and starts barricading the door. Alice grabs a bat to defend herself and hides in the kitchen when suddenly Brenda's body is thrown through the window, seemingly getting stabbed in the chest. Alice runs out of the kitchen and sees the headlights of a car outside, thinking it's Steve Christie, but it's not. It turns out to be a woman named Mrs. Voorhees, who says she worked at Camp Crystal Lake. Alice tells Mrs. Voorhees about the dead bodies, and once she sees the body of Brenda, she says it wasn't a good idea to open up the camp again. She then proceeds to tell Alice about the young boy that drowned at Camp Crystal Lake, blaming the counselors for not paying attention. We realize that the boy that drowned was named Jason, and that Mrs. Voorhees was his mother. She also reveals that she was the killer the whole time and attempts to kill Alice, but gets hit with a fire poker. As Alice runs out of the cabin, she finds the bodies of Annie in the car, and Steve Christie falls from the tree and hangs upside down. Mrs. Voorhees sees Alice running away and proceeds to follow her, talking in Jason's voice, telling her to kill Alice, and she says that she will avenge his death for him. Alice runs into a nearby shed to grab a gun to defend herself, but can't find the ammo for the gun. She gets cornered by Mrs. Voorhees as she proceeds to slap and throw her around. Alice retaliates by hitting Mrs. Voorhees with the butt of her gun. Alice escapes again and runs back to the cabin, turning off all the lights to not be seen, and proceeds to hide in the pantry. Mrs. Voorhees enters the cabin and starts searching for Alice. When Alice hears the door close, she thinks Mrs. Voorhees left, but then Mrs. Voorhees proceeds to break down the door with her machete, and then gets knocked out when Alice hits her in the head with a pan. Alice runs out of the cabin and arrives at the shore of the lake and sits, comprehending what just happened. Then out of nowhere, Mrs. Voorhees appears behind Alice, starting a fight by the shore. Alice picks up Mrs. Voorhees' machete and decapitates her. Alice then proceeds to get in a boat and fall asleep inside of it. A police car pulls up into the camp to save Alice, and Alice sees them, thinking that the nightmare is finally over, until a decomposing Jason Voorhees comes out of the water and grabs Alice and pulls her underwater. The camera pans down towards the water, but then Alice wakes up in the hospital, asking the cop if they found Jason. The cop says that nobody else was there, and Alice realizes it was only a dream, and that Jason is still at the bottom of the lake, ending the movie. Now, when it comes to the story, I'm pretty mixed about it. I think some parts of it are great and other parts just make the film worse and kind of drag down the film. First, with the positives. I really love all the scenes with Mrs. Voorhees. Although she's only in the film for the final 15 minutes or so, she's the highlight of the film. She's so evil and Betsy Palmer goes all out with her performance. I also love how we get a history of Camp Crystal Lake, so we understand why the camp is being called Camp Blood. It gives the place a foreboding atmosphere, with the place so isolated in the forest, and there are so many trees and cabins, the killer could be hiding anywhere, which leaves you in suspense, making you wonder what's going to happen next. That being said, let's talk about the negatives. One of the biggest problems with this movie is its pacing. It's common for horror movies to have slow, quiet scenes right before a kill or a jump scare, which this movie uses pretty well sometimes. But the problem is that there are way too many of these scenes. There are scenes where people are just talking or doing other things around the camp that just pad out the runtime, like Alice making coffee, or the scene where they killed a snake. And apparently, that was a real snake. Apparently, there was a snake on set owned by someone, and Tom Savini told the guy they were just going to borrow it, and the crew decided to kill it for real. So in the movie, when you see the snake get chopped up, it was an actual snake getting chopped up, which is kind of sad and cruel for any animal to die in a movie. So, like I said, there are a lot of meaningless scenes, which makes the film really boring in some parts, and these scenes don't really affect the overall plot of the movie. Another problem I have with this movie is the plot twist with Mrs. Voorhees. Now, I like the plot twist and I like Betsy Palmer's performance, but the real problem I have with the twist with Mrs. Voorhees is how you would never guess that she's the killer. She's only introduced in the final 15 minutes or so of the movie, so you would never think that she would be behind the murders. If she was a main character alongside the other counselors, it would have made the twist much more shocking, and when she snaps, it would have been much more effective. And if she was in the whole movie, when she talks about Jason drowning in the lake, it would have made sense and we would have understood her motives even more instead of her dropping all the information on us in the final few minutes. Now, when talking about this franchise as a whole, one of the most iconic scenes is the scene where a decomposing Jason Voorhees rises from the lake and pulls Alice down into the water. To me, it's the best scene in the movie and the best scene in the whole franchise, but I think it could have been better. First, the reason I think it's so good is because it's so unexpected, and the image of a deformed, zombified child is horrifying, leaving you with an unsettling feeling. But what could have made the ending better is when the camera points down to the water, the movie should have just ended right then and there. But instead, we have Alice waking up in the hospital, and we realize that what we just saw was only a dream. It completely ruins what would have been a great ending. While the ending is still good, I would have gotten rid of that part where they say it was only a dream because it's such a cliche movie trope, and I just think it would have been a lot better if that was how the movie ended. The Friday the 13th series is infamous for having very bland, boring, and lackluster characters that are just stereotypes just to be killed. We have the jokester, the horny sex couple, and several others that we will see in practically every movie in the series afterwards. It's really hard to care for these characters because they don't do much, which is pretty much the case for most of the characters in the franchise. The characters are fine, I guess, but they're not interesting, and there are a lot more interesting characters that would come later in the franchise. The only characters that really matter are Mrs. Voorhees and Alice. Mrs. Voorhees is obviously a standout and is the best character in the movie by far, but what about Alice, our final girl? To be honest, I think she's just fine. She's one of the more interesting characters in the franchise, especially from a final girl standpoint, but comparing her to other horror movie final girls like Laurie Strode from Halloween, Sidney Prescott from Scream, Ellen Ripley from Alien, or Sienna Shaw from Terrifier, she doesn't really stand out much. If we knew more about her personally, she would have been an even more developed character. It just seems like the only reason she is here is to be the final girl. And with that out of the way, I guess I should talk about Jason a little bit. It's surprising that the killer that is basically the mascot for this franchise isn't the killer in this movie and only makes a brief cameo, which is a common mistake among people who haven't seen the film, as they suspect that since Jason is the killer in all the other movies, they assume that he is the killer in this movie too. We wouldn't see Jason as the killer until the sequel, where he would become the killer for the rest of the series except for part 5. In this movie, we don't know much about him at this point in the series, but the backstory surrounding him, having drowned due to the camp counselors not paying attention, makes him an interesting character, despite having such a small scene at the end, setting him up to be the iconic horror movie villain he is today. Like a lot of the kills in Friday the 13th, they were heavily affected by the MPAA, who basically butchered this franchise when it came to the kills in most of these movies. I'm not saying that all of the kills in all of the movies were affected, but when they were, it made the film pretty boring because the main reason we watch movies like Friday the 13th are for the kills. And when it comes to the kills in this movie, they are some of the major examples of kills affected by the MPAA. Most of the kills are pretty lackluster, happening off screen, and when we do see what happened to them, it leaves a lot to be desired, since most of the kills are just people getting stabbed or getting their throats slit, when other kills in the franchise became a lot more creative. A lot of blood isn't shown either, which is something we want to see in a slasher movie. The only really good kills are Jack getting an arrow through the neck, Marcy getting an axe to the face, and Mrs. Voorhees getting decapitated with a machete. The special effects for those kills are really good, especially with the budget, and they're a lot more creative than the other kills in the movie, which is what you would want to see in these types of movies. The atmosphere and setting of this movie is great. Since this film is set in a camp in the middle of a forest, it gives the viewers a sense of isolation and fear of what could be lurking around every tree. You don't know when or where the killer will appear, and it builds up the suspense well for the most part. But as I said, the suspense can be kind of ruined with so many pointless scenes that drag on for far too long. The actual setting of the rundown camp is great, and you actually believe that it's been decades since the camp has been opened, and it looks like nobody has been in the camp for years, with the rotting wood, dirty water in the lake, and all of the supplies covered in dust and dirt. It makes this place look almost haunted in a way. To be honest, with all of the pointless, dragged on scenes to help build tension, this movie isn't really that scary. That's not to say it doesn't have scary moments. The scene where Marcy is by herself in the bathroom and she sees the shower curtain move, and when she goes to check it out, is scary. And the tension is really good in this scene, as when she pulls the curtain back and sees nothing, it gives you a false sense of security until she's killed a few seconds later. Another part is when Brenda is thrown through the window because you're not expecting this. And this is right after Alice boarded up the cabin after finding Bill's body. And we think that's it. The music has stopped, Alice is seemingly safe, and there are no noises. And then all of a sudden, Brenda's dead body is thrown through the window, reigniting the tension and the fear all over again. And the most obvious scene we're talking about scares is the scene where zombified Jason pulls Alice underwater. It is so unexpected because you, along with Alice and the rest of the audience, think that the movie is over and the horrors are over. And then Alice gets pulled underwater by Jason. It's really unsettling seeing a decaying, deformed little boy leap out of the water and pull our final girl underwater. It truly catches you off guard. To say that this movie was a success would be an understatement. The film had a budget of only $550,000 and managed to make $59.8 million dollars at the box office, which was huge for an independent film. Despite being a movie to bank off the success of Halloween and to basically be a ripoff, it was a huge success, leading to a whole slew of even more slasher movies, along with movies such as Halloween, Black Christmas, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It is considered to be in the golden age of slasher movies, where slasher movies were just getting their start. Because of these movies being huge successes, it not only led to rip-offs, but also several original slasher movies that continue to expand on the concept and continue to push the boundaries of what could be shown. This film and the whole franchise in general, along with other horror movies, helped give us many common tropes that would be seen in other horror movies, becoming the template for most slasher movies after, such as the car nut starting trope, the death by sex trope, the stupid decisions trope, the final girl trope, the tripping and falling trope, the one last scare trope, and so on and so forth. It also gave us one of the most iconic horror movie villains of all time, Jason Voorhees, who would rise the ranks as arguably the greatest horror movie villain of all time. Despite not being the killer until the sequel, people were intrigued by Jason immediately due to the backstory given to him. He later became the main killer in the franchise and would become iconic in pop culture, appearing in magazines, video games, comic books, crossovers, merchandise, and has been spoofed in several TV shows. Since this film was such a success and it ended on a cliffhanger, with the viewers questioning if Jason was still alive or not, Paramount knew they had a hit on their hands and knew that with the success of this movie, there had to be a sequel. While this movie did give us a great franchise, this movie isn't the best one. Don't get me wrong, some of the kills are great. The scene with Jason pulling Alice under the water is amazing, and Betsy Palmer as Mrs. Voorhees is phenomenal. But the film just drags on in several scenes that do nothing but pad the runtime. The characters are boring, and some of the kills are pretty lackluster. The film also ruins the ending by saying that Jason pulling Alice in the water was only a dream, and the twist with Mrs. Voorhees is basically impossible to guess because they only introduce her in the final act. Still, the impact that it made on the horror genre and pop culture in general can't be ignored. With that being said, I give Friday the 13th a 5.5 out of 10. Thank you so much for watching my very first movie review. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe to my channel, and watch my other videos if you enjoyed this one. I have many other movies planned to review, so stay tuned to see what I review next. I'll see you next time.